Hey there, everyone. It's James Lindsay, and you are listening to another episode of the new Discourses Podcast. And we're exploring Lenin. In fact, we're going to continue. We started in chapter 5 rather than doing this in order. We're going to continue with our reading of Vladimir Lenin's The State and Revolution, which he wrote and published in 1917, which is the same year that he successfully led the Bolshevik Revolution against Russia a few months later. And obviously the title of this book, The State and Revolution, tells you what the book is about. It's about the state. What is a state? What is a state for? What does it do? How does it work? And then revolution, which is, of course, the objective of the communist entering into the society that's governed by the state. Chapter 1 of this book is titled The State. So it's about the state. It's in fact titled fully The State, a Product of the Irreconcilability of Class Antagonisms. So this book was written largely kind of as a notebook, mostly to himself. He wasn't sure, from what I can tell, having read about it, if he was going to publish it or not. It was a notebook where he was working out his thoughts on various comments of Engels, primarily, Friedrich Engels, and to a degree, Marx. But, I mean, it's all about Marx. You're going to hear Marx. Marx is in the first sentence. We're going to hear a lot of Marx, but he quotes Engels a great deal, and I think that's because Engels is much more clear on what he thinks about how a state should be developed and what the difference between a state that maintains class antagonisms, like a capitalist state, and a state that will naturally wither away to communism, like an idealized socialist state, which is what he wanted to be able to install. And that's what this chapter is about. I want to read this so you can hear Lenin and understand Lenin. Why? Well, a couple of reasons. Lenin, I think virtually everything communist can draw a straight line, of course, back to Marx, but a straight line back to Lenin. Marx did not have a theory for implementing Marxism whatsoever. They did some agitation, it didn't work. He said go among the workers and teach them, kind of like an evangelism model, and it didn't work. Lenin came up with the vanguard model, and the vanguard model was going to force communism onto a society by setting up a revolutionary party who would overthrow an existing government, establish a socialist state in line with Marxist theory, and use the inversion of praxis, so to speak, to transform people. Let me briefly explain that, but I want to give you the second reason before I do that. The second reason is that you're going to see extraordinarily ominous parallels to what we're experiencing in America and throughout the West today. If you're living in the United Kingdom under Keir Starmer, or you're living in Canada under Justin Trudeau, or you are living in the United States under the Democratic Party regime, particularly in one of the blue states, the heavy-duty blue states like California, Maryland, Minnesota, Massachusetts, or even some of these, battleground states like Pennsylvania or Virginia or Michigan, I think you're going to find a lot of this very familiar. And speaking of very blue states, I shouldn't skip one of the ones we always tend to forget, which is dear old New Mexico. Very, very blue, shouldn't be. But the communists took over New Mexico some time ago, and the state is now 2-1 socialists, more or less, or Democrats, but they're operating as socialists in their state legislature with one of the most fearsome Democratic governors. Remember, Grisham is their governor, and she actually suspended illegally, and the Supreme Court had to overrule her and stop her, but she suspended Second Amendment rights in New Mexico for a period of about 30 days, if I remember the timeline right, but you could double check the facts. So chapter 1, I said that wrong, by the way, earlier. What I said was the state, a product of irreconcilability of class antagonisms, is not the title of chapter 1. That's the title of section 1 inside chapter 1. I'm sorry. Chapter 1 is titled Class, Society, and the State, and that's what we're going to read here from Vladimir Lenin. So chapter 1, Class, Society, and the State, pardon the error, and I'm not going to start over, so deal with it. And Section 1, the state, a product of the irreconcilability of class antagonism. So here we're going to get Lenin's theory of the state, what it's for, how it works. And like I said, as this develops, we're going to see ominous parallels to what we're living under today and what we thought are Western democratic republics. And we're going to hear Lenin's, I think it's in this chapter, it might be in the next chapter, but we're going to hear some of Lenin's remarks at some point. We'll get to, if it's not in this chapter, in another episode, where Lenin remarks on the democratic republic. Maybe that was in chapter 5, I don't remember. But the point is, just to give you it in case it doesn't show up, and we'll get it in detail if it does, that the democratic republic is, for Lenin, the highest form of government that isn't socialist. And so if it didn't have all of the class antagonisms of capitalism still buried in it, then you would actually be able to move on to a true democracy. But the true democracy lies outside of the space of the democratic republic. That might have been in chapter 5 from last time. I kind of blur together on what pieces of this book, which I didn't even read in order for myself, by the way. Normally I read a book start to finish, but I read chapter 5 a long time ago, reread it, then did the podcast. And in the meantime, I've read actually in between those, I read 1 and 2, and then I did the podcast. Then I read the rest of the book, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it's somewhere in there. Chapter 1, Class, Society, and the State. Section 1, the state, a product of the irreconcilability of class antagonism. So let's break down that language. The state is characterized in this subject heading as a product of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms. So we remember from Marx, first page of the Communist Manifesto, that he says that the movement of all of history is the development of class antagonisms between groups of people. So you have classes of people, the wealthy and the unwealthy, the middle class and the poor, whatever it is, right? He gives a long list. Oppressor versus oppressed is the way to understand them, he says. And the movement of all of history is their clash, their conflict, the antagonism between them, which he says eventually comes to a point of revolution. And he says the only two outcomes of this conflict as history moves are the revolutionary reconstruction of society at large, following the revolution which comes from below, or the common ruin of the contending classes. There is no you get put down, you get stopped. So there's common ruin, or the class from below rises up and takes power. So what Lenin is saying here is that, and following Engels as it turns out, is that the state only exists because that class antagonism cannot be reconciled. This is going to be a very important perspective to understand. That means that the state is, he says, is a product of the irreconcilability. So you have class antagonisms that can't sort themselves out. And in fact, what he's going to argue is that the state steps in to make sure that they don't work out, because the working out of those class antagonisms, which are irreconcilable, there's no solution. But the only way to maintain order, law and order, and prosperity, the only way to do that is to suppress violence. But the only way to advance history is through a violent revolution from below. Therefore, the state exists to maintain the current situation of oppression. And that's his model. Now, before I start reading, this is a whack analysis that we're now very, very familiar with from communists, that everything has to do with the application, the unjust application of power against people that they don't want, against revolutionaries, frankly, against communists. But it's also the iron law of woke projection, which never misses. When we read that concept through the iron law of woke projection, what that gives us is the idea that the purpose of the state is, in fact, to suppress the elements that are against the interests of the state, which anybody who knows anything about Soviet Union or Mao's China, the People's Republic of China, know that that's exactly what they did, because that's what they think is the intrinsic purpose of a state. The thing is that they believe that people who are socialist are enlightened and are therefore doing it for the right reasons and the right way to get to the right place and to the right movement forward in history. And people who are not socialists are fallen and ignorant and selfish and evil and consumed by depravity that will prevent us from ever moving forward properly in history. And therefore, there is a right way and a wrong way to apply state power. One for social justice that the communists do by suppressing and destroying their class enemies, and one that maintains the order of a democratic republic and a capitalist market economy, which they say is actually a form of class antagonism. So their claim is that the state exists to maintain the set of class antagonisms, or a state that's fully enlightened can take power and can crush all opposition, because that's what the state does, crush all opposition, and thus move forward toward communism. But one last point to bring up before we continue is notice the thing that got left out. In Lenin's formulation, as we're going to hear it, the state exists to prevent violence between classes. But that's necessary for the revolutionary advancement of society. So that piece gets taken out, and guess what communist regimes are characterized by? That's right, violence, all the time, always, as long as it's designed to advance the interests of the socialist state and its power and the usually cult of personality of its leaders. So let's read Lenin, Chapter 1, Class, Society, and the State, of the book The State and Revolution from 1917. And again, Section 1, the state is a product of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms. And here's how Lenin starts off. And I think you'll appreciate how clear Lenin is. He's easy to understand for the most part. Given that he's dealing with Marxist theory, it's a challenge, but he's pretty clear, much more clear than the woke today. He says, what is now happening to Marxist theory, remember this is 1917, what is now happening to Marxist theory has in the course of history happened repeatedly to the theories of revolutionary thinkers and leaders of oppressed classes fighting for emancipation. During the lifetime of great revolutionaries, the oppressing classes constantly hounded them, received their theories with the most savage malice and the most furious hatred and the most unscrupulous campaigns of lies and slander. I give you the iron law of woke projection, ladies and gentlemen. So what he's saying is that all revolutionary thinkers are met with hostility from the powers that be, which he says is savage malice, furious hatred, and unscrupulous campaigns of lies and slander. We all know that that's communist bread and butter, so the iron law of woke projection never misses. On the lies and slander point, we can give communists a little bit of credit, not much. They may not legitimately be, no, that's not the right way. They may not believe that they're actually lying about people lying about them. Saying, oh my God, they're lying about me. The thing is communists are religious zealots. They're not normal people doing an economic theory or a theory of society or politics. This is not what they're doing. They're not political scientists. They're not economists. They're religious fanatics who have a completely crackpot religion. And as we've explored for years here on the podcast, and you've probably found in your own explorations, normal people can't understand a damn thing they're talking about. So when people explain in very plain language what they're perceiving about communist theory, the communist puts on the crying Wojak face and is like, you don't understand us. You just don't get it. You didn't read it right. And they throw their little fit. And so they would accuse people of speaking plainly about Marxism or revolution as engaging in lies and slander, when in fact they are not. But the communist believes in his religious mania that he actually has a higher understanding of the world that these lowly idiots don't understand, so they must be lying and slandering. But I don't want to digress with that further. Lenin goes on, he says, after their death, meaning the death of the revolutionary characters like Marx, attempts are made to convert them into harmless icons, to canonize them, so to say, and to hallow their names to a certain extent for the consolation of the oppressed classes, and with the object of duping the latter, while at the same time robbing the revolutionary theory of its substance, blunting its revolutionary edge and vulgarizing it. Today, the bourgeoisie and the opportunists within the labor movement concur in this doctoring of Marxism. So what he's saying here is that the bourgeoisie actually oppose them, and the opportunists, that's going to be his enemies, which are going to be softer socialists of different kinds who are, maybe more incremental, not so violent, not so revolutionary. In particular, he's talking about the Bolshevik Party, which was a big tent socialist party at the time. He calls them opportunists, and they, in fact, are not going into the revolutionary edge of Marx. They're holding up Marx as a totem or an icon and taking out all the revolutionary violent substance that's actually there, so that they can kind of have a feel-good Marx religion. Oh yeah, we're Marxists or whatever, but no, we're not actually going to kill people in order to install Marxism. And this is how the bourgeoisie and the opportunists within the labor movement concur in this doctoring of Marxism. They omit, obscure, or distort the revolutionary side of this theory, its revolutionary soul. They push to the foreground and extol what is or seems acceptable to the bourgeoisie. All the social chauvinists are now, quote, Marxists. Don't laugh, he says. And more frequently, German bourgeois scholars, only yesterday specialists in the annihilation of Marxism, are speaking of the National German Marx, who they claim educated the labor unions, which are so splendidly organized for the purpose of waging a predatory war. By the way, those same National German Marxists are the ones who pissed off Hitler to the point, and maybe we'll do a podcast about that sometime, to where Hitler did what Hitler did and blamed the Jews, because turns out he blamed all of the activity of the Social Democrats. He said, I noticed that which is the Bolsheviks, as they were in the Social Democratic Party of Germany, he blamed them. He noticed, he says, he was just noticing things, that they're all Jewish. So therefore the problem isn't in fact communists, the problem in fact is Jews. And that's the generalization leap, the hasty generalization, you might say, that Hitler made for a variety of reasons that we don't have time to get into, where this isn't a podcast about Hitler. It's worth touching on them, I guess. Number one is that he was super pissed off at them all the time. Number two is that because of folkish nationalist beliefs about the German and the outsiders within Germany, including Jewish outsiders who are in diaspora, there was a lot of anti-Semitism. That anti-Semitism wasn't new. It wasn't like a 19th and early 20th century phenomenon in Germany. In fact, Hitler held up Martin Luther, writing in the 16th century, the early 16th century, writing things like On the Jews and Their Lies, which is one of the more horrific tracts Martin Luther wrote as one of the key German texts. And so that was another reason that Hitler was predisposed to make those mistakes, to take that horrific path. But thirdly, the theosophy, the occult religion of Helena Blavatsky. Helena Blavatsky, not Adolf Hitler, is the one who imported the swastika, who imported the concept of spiritual root races, in particular the highest of the spiritual root races being the Aryan race. This all comes from Helena Blavatsky, who is the exact same person who went on to influence Alice Bailey, who had led to influencing Robert Mueller from the United Nations, Julian Huxley of the United Nations and UNESCO, Robert Mueller having created Common Core, by the way, and then John Fetzer, from whose institute came social emotional learning. Same Helena Blavatsky, the same Helena Blavatsky who inspired the organizations that preceded the Fabian Society and Annie Besant, who was an early Fabian socialist. The same Helena Blavatsky who I already covered, Alice Bailey, who inspired Margaret Sanger of the Internet, or of Planned Parenthood as it was, who was also trying to figure out how to use the planning of parenthood and other eugenics means, more specifically, to contour the root race profile so that we would have more Aryans and fewer what they called Lemurians in society. And that's all gross, weird, spiritual eugenics stuff. And so that was a third reason that Hitler was motivated the way that he was. But it was these particular National German former Marxists or Marxists that Lenin is complaining about sometime before Hitler has his rise, maybe almost a decade before he wrote Mein Kampf, who they claim, Lenin tells us, educated labor unions, which are so splendidly organized for the purpose of waging a predatory war. So Lenin has similar dispositions here, but for different reasons. Lenin wants them to be more Marxist. Hitler wants them not to be. He wants them instead to be National German Socialists. Oof. Anyway, we digressed. Lenin goes on. In these circumstances, in view, remember he's talking about how the revolutionary icons like Marx of the past, revolutionary icons are held up by the opportunists, by the weak socialists, the Mensheviks, the National German Socialists. They're held up as icons, but that their revolutionary spirit has been blunted and taken away, and they're contested by the bourgeoisie, which means the middle class, with its dipping into the producer class. In these circumstances, Lenin says, in the view of the unprecedentedly widespread distortion of Marxism, our prime task is to re-establish what Marx really taught on the subject of the state. So this is 1917. Marx has died a couple of decades earlier. Marx wrote Capital in 1867. So there's an easy benchmark. That was 50 years before that he wrote Capital. Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto almost 20 years before that, 19 years to be specific. So 69 years earlier in 1848, Marx writes the Communist Manifesto, and he wrote the Economic Philosophic Manuscripts and his key critiques of Hegel and Hegel's philosophy in Feuerbach 4 years or so, 3 to 4 to 5 years earlier, depending on which one we're talking about, than that. So getting close to 75 years since Marx kind of burst out on the scene. So what Lenin's saying, is that Marxists have lost Marx, and he's going to bring it back. Right? He says our prime task is to reestablish what Marx really taught on the subject of the state. He says this will necessitate a number of long quotations from the works of Marx and Engels themselves. Of course, long quotations will render the text cumbersome and not help at all to make it popular reading, which is too bad, because if it had been popular reading, we wouldn't be going through this crap right now. But we cannot possibly dispense with them. All, or at any rate, the most essential passages in the works of Marx and Engels on the subject of the state must by all means be quoted as fully as possible, so that the reader may form an independent opinion of the totality of the views of the founders of scientific socialism, which is what Marx and Engels thought they were producing, in addition to Marx calling it humanism, and the evolution of those views, so that their distortion by the Kautskyism now prevailing may be documentarily proved and clearly demonstrated. So Lenin is going to go after this guy Kautsky and a couple of other people a lot, and I don't know those factions well enough. I think Kautsky, if I remember right, was a social democrat, but he veered toward the Menshevik approach, but I don't remember the details of this. But basically you can tell what's going on. Lenin was like, to hell with that guy. He's not doing Marx right. He's in the opportunist faction. And so we're going to go back to the hardline revolutionary edge that Marx always intended. So Lenin says, let us begin with the most popular of Engels' works, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, the 6th edition of which was published in Stuttgart as far back as 1894. We have to translate the quotations from the German originals, as the Russian translations, while very numerous, are for the most part either incomplete or very unsatisfactory. Summing up his historical analysis, Engels says, quote, "The state is therefore by no means a power forced on society from without, just as little as it is the reality of the ethical idea, the image," so that's a dig at Hegel, "the image and reality of reason," as Hegel maintains. Rather, it is the product of society at a certain stage of development. So the state is a product of society. This is Engels. The state is a product of society at a certain stage of development. So in other words, the state itself is coming out of society. Society has its issues, and the state comes out of the society, recognizing its issues as a means of managing those issues. I'm going to use that word instead of solving. So Engels says it is a product of society at a certain stage of development. It is the admission that this society has become entangled in an insoluble contradiction with itself. Remember, the Marxists believe that if there were no contradictions between people, or the way people think, or having different ideas, or institutions, or there were no contradictions between people, you wouldn't need a government. This is the ultimate crackpot libertarian fantasy behind the scenes of all Marxism, is that if you could make everybody think the same thing, then you wouldn't need a government. And so what he's saying is that the existence of the state itself is the admission that society has become entangled. Not that they just always exist, right? And that there is no solution, there's only trade-offs. No, it has become entangled in an insoluble contradiction with itself that has split into irreconcilable antagonisms, which it is powerless to dispel. So in other words, again, it can't get rid of the contradictions, or it can't get rid of the fact that there are differing interests and trade-offs in a thriving society, and therefore you have to have the state. And the state is a reflection of the organization of the society and its contradictions. Engels goes on, but in order that these antagonisms, these classes with conflicting economic interests, might not consume themselves in society in fruitless struggle, it became necessary to have a power, seemingly standing above society that would alleviate the conflict and keep it within the bounds of, quote, order. And this power arisen out of society, but placing itself above it and alienating itself more and more from it is the state. So there's a lot to unpack in that. I'm not going to go into most of it, but I want to focus on that last part. I already covered kind of the other part, right? There's contradictions in society. There are economic classes. Really, it'd be better to say individuals with conflicting interests. Thinking in terms of classes is how you get in these traps that Engels and Marx have laid for people. But in Lenin, obviously, it's not about classes. Individuals have different economic and social and cultural and just individual interests, and they are in conflict with one another. Therefore, so that the society might not consume itself in fruitless struggle, it became necessary to have a power called the state. So that's where the state comes from, and that's the state's job. And now you can say, well, that's clearly the state's job. It's a conflict management. It's an incorporation of the people to achieve conflict management, right? Now, in the United States, notice that we say that a state derives its just powers by securing our rights, and that's all it has the space to do. It doesn't actually have the power to solve our problems for us. That's a different model. But this is where this gets deep and important to pay attention, because I always get attacked. James, it's not a Gnostic belief system. Yes, it's a Gnostic belief system. James said Gnosticism, everybody drink. It's a Gnostic belief system. Why? Because it is a power standing above society, although it came out of society. That's the illusion, according to Engels, that would alleviate the conflict and keep it within the bounds of, quote, order. He doesn't believe that what we have is order, obviously. And this power, and here's where it's Gnostic, arisen out of society but placing itself above it and alienating itself more and more from it, is the state. So the state is the alien, but in the Gnostic belief system, the state is the demiurge. So that means the creator, the builder, that which built the world, that built everything in the kind of old Christian Gnostic myths from the first century and the Jewish Gnostic myths from before that, or other Gnostic myths. So the demiurge is actually an evil spirit that has constructed the world and imprisoned everybody within it. And it's therefore a power that is positioning itself above the state. And that, in fact, if you believe that we are also as gods and that's been hidden from us, then it's no different. It's actually God has arisen out of us, right? And that is a Gnostic belief very frequently. And so this power has illegitimately arisen out of society, but placed itself above it and alienated itself more and more from that which it controls. So it becomes the controlling alien. This is, I don't know how many times they have to say alienation and the alien and alien power. I don't know how many times Marx has to say this, or Marxists down to the woke today have to say this before people will accept that, as a matter of fact, this is a Gnostic belief system, but you have it right there. This is literally him saying that the state erects itself as a demiurge. Now we have to read this as both their whack analysis, like I said before, but then secondly, the iron law of woke projection. We already understand it as its whack analysis. That's a weird way to understand the state. Sure, the state is there to help us adjudicate our conflicts of interest when we aren't able to do so for ourselves, and it's meant to secure our rights both from the government, but also from other unjust applications of power of one man to another, or one entity like a corporation onto others. Fine, we'd think that that's what the state's about, but their whack analysis isn't quite that. It's like this weird alien power that's trying to control everything, specifically just to keep order, even though the conditions that the state operates over are intolerable to one or more classes of that society. I hope some communists show up and say that I don't understand Marxism, because they can kiss my ass. I am so nailing this. But then there's the iron law of woke projection. They think the state operates with demiurgic power, and it should and it must operate with demiurgic power. This is a very important point, because when they seize the means of production and they seize control of the state, that means they're going to set up a totalitarian state. They are going to assume the mantle of the demiurge in order to control society. Now, I promised to unpack inversion of praxis for you, so this is a good time. Marx believed that people do praxis, that's activism in line with theory, and they do their praxis to change society, but the society itself socializes everybody into being who they are. You are actually a product of your social conditions and economic conditions. And because you're a product of your social and economic conditions, your political condition, because you're a product of that, you are basically contoured by that demiurgic power of the society which is incorporated in the state, that is forcing you to be who you are, even though that might not be who you really are. You might actually be socialist, not feudal, or socialist and not capitalist. In fact, that's what Marx believed, is that we're all intrinsically socialist, but we're alienated from that by an alien power, that is the existing class society. Okay. So the idea here is, well, that's called that socialization is called the inversion of praxis. Praxis comes back, inverts, and socializes people to be who they actually are. And so they only understand themselves in terms of the conditions of society that they've inherited from the existing society that's already there, which prevents them from seeing revolutionary possibilities for a different society. That is the way that the Marxist demiurge keeps you fallen, which is, of course, the bourgeois classes, the elite classes, or the ruling classes of the bourgeois state. So that's the inversion of praxis thing. So what this means is that the communists believe that's what the state is. It's naturally a demiurgic phenomenon, that when they control it, that they're going to be able to be like the anti-demiurge. I'm actually going to make the joke about it being a semi-demiurge later, and you'll see why that makes sense. And that they're like this anti-demiurge who assumes demiurgic power, increases its demiurgic power. That means the power to constrain and control everybody so that they can force socialist inversion of praxis on people until they're transformed into socialists. But because they believe that socialists have a liberated mindset that's no longer trapped by the antagonisms of class, that actually is like a loophole that gets them out of being tyrants. They are liberators rather than tyrants because of this inverted understanding. But they believe, and this is key, that to get to communism, you have to seize power like a Gnostic demiurge. In other words, like an all-powerful creative demon that will then contour people to believe that they are socialist until the people wake up and believe that they in fact are socialist. And when everybody who's still alive actually wakes up, has a qualitative change, has positive transcendence of private property as human self-estrangement, as Marx put it, then when everybody who's still alive becomes the genuine communist, not a crude communist who merely hates capitalism, but in fact a transformed socialist who recognizes his species being and his true nature as socialist, then it'll work. And so they're going to force that to work. And that's the program. That's what 20th century communism in Soviet Union and PRC, People's Republic of China, that's what that was about. So now we've heard Engels express it, and that's how Lenin basically starts off. Lenin says, this expresses with perfect clarity the basic idea of Marxism with regard to the historical role and the meaning of the state. The state is a product and manifestation of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms. The state arises where, when, and insofar as class antagonism objectively can't be reconciled. So you have the bourgeois class and you have the proletariat class in capitalism, or you have the lord and the royal class, the lord class, and the landlord class, and the serf class in feudalism. And when they work out as much as they can work out, and they bang heads as much as they can, but there are irreconcilable parts to their class antagonism. And when they can't do any more to reconcile it, when the class antagonism objectively can't be reconciled, that's where the state emerges. That's where the state comes in. He says, and conversely, the existence of the state proves that the class antagonisms are irreconcilable, because you wouldn't need a state power to reconcile their class antagonisms, or to manage them is a better way to put that, because they're not reconcilable, right? They're irreconcilable, contradictory class antagonisms that cannot be reconciled by the state, but they can be managed. And so since you need a manager of the antagonism, that is proof that the antagonisms exist. So the state, the existence of the state, proves that the class antagonisms not just exist, but they are irreconcilable. That's what Lenin is telling you. It is on this most important and fundamental point that the distortion of Marxism proceeding along two main lines begins. On the one hand, the bourgeoisie the bourgeois, in particular, that means the middle class. In particular, the petty bourgeois, that's the lower middle class, ideologists, particularly the petty bourgeoisie ideologists, compelled under the weight of indisputable historical facts to admit that the state only exists where there are class antagonisms and a class struggle, correct Marx, quotes around correct, quote, correct Marx. So the bourgeoisie, the petty bourgeois, the ideologists, compelled under the weight of indisputable historical facts to admit that the state only exists where there are class antagonisms, because you wouldn't need any if people didn't have different interests that were colliding with one another, and a class struggle. They go about these bourgeoisie and ideologists and petty bourgeois go about correcting Marx, but fakely, falsely, incorrectly correcting Marx in such a way as to make it appear that the state is an organ for the reconciliation of classes. See, he already said that the class antagonisms are in fact irreconcilable, so they can't be reconciled. So the bourgeois say, no, the point of the state isn't just to manage, it's actually to reconcile these class antagonisms. That's what the state does. That's not actually what the state is supposed to do. In a liberal democratic republic, the state is there to secure our rights and to be a conflict resolution mechanism of last resort. That's why we have courts. When you and your neighbor can't work it out, you go to court to figure out how it's going to be judged, and you abide by both of those. When you believe your neighbor is violating your rights, you can take him to court if you can't get him to stop through persuasion or whatever, so that it doesn't resort to violence. So it is a conflict resolution device amongst antagonisms across conflicting interests. That's how the state actually works, but the simplistic two-dimensional hate-filled Marx theory doesn't see it that way. And what it's going to prove, according to Lenin, is that it's the guarantor of class antagonism. It's the thing that keeps it going. But what he's saying is that the bourgeoisie step into what's going on, the petty bourgeois and the ideologists, they step in and they say that, no, Marx had it a little bit wrong. He had some good ideas, but they have a little bit wrong. The fact is that the state is actually reconciling the class conflicts. It's making the poor and the rich work together, or the poor and the middle class work together. It's making the worker and the managers work together in a productive fashion. Well, Lenin says that that's wrong. He then says also, according to Marx, the state could neither have arisen nor maintained itself had it been possible to reconcile classes. Like I just said, it's irreconcilable. From what the petty bourgeois and Philistine professors and publicists say, with quite fervent and benevolent references to Marx, it appears that the state does reconcile classes. According to Marx, the state is an organ of class rule, an organ for the oppression of one class by another. It is the creation of, quote, order that legalizes and perpetuates this oppression by moderating the conflict between classes. That's extremely important. Revolutionary violence is actually supposed to be, according to Marx, a solution for the oppressed class versus their oppressor. And the state steps in and says, well, revolutionary violence is off the table. You're not allowed to do that. And so they could take what I just said about conflict resolution and say, see, James, you agree with Marx. Revolutionary violence is off the table for you. Yeah, that's because I want a productive, prosperous society. And not everybody who has revolutionary angst is correct or valid in that. In fact, some of them are just crazy. In fact, dangerously crazy or power hungry. Like Marx and Lenin, as history proved. In the opinion of the petty bourgeois politicians, however, so that's like our state representatives probably, lower middle class people in politics. In the opinion of the petty bourgeois politicians, however, order means the reconciliation of classes and not the oppression of one class by another. To alleviate the conflict means reconciling classes and not depriving the oppressed classes of definite means and method of struggle to overthrow the oppressors. So again, what he's saying is the mistake that the bourgeois classes make is that they take revolutionary violence as the resolution to oppression off of the table. Now, all of my friends, and I know several out there, certainly Daryl Bernard Harrison and Virgil Walker come to mind talking about CRT, will see this immediately. I remember listening to them talk years ago, back in like 2021 or 2020 maybe, very early on. I think it's 2020. Early 2020, like before COVID 2020, January 2020, I remember listening to them talk about this idea that, they're talking about CRT and how CRT, critical race theory, race Marxism, and how it's sold to the church in particular. This would be evangelical denominations in the Southern Baptist Convention, but this could all generalize. It all generalizes perfectly to all of society. We heard it all with the whole of society, but we'll use this example. They were talking about how critical race theory or race Marxism was sold to the Southern Baptist Convention and to churches as a means of doing racial reconciliation. And they were making the point that races don't reconcile, hearts reconcile, individuals reconcile, classes don't reconcile with one another, races don't reconcile with one another. Why not? Because for the only way for two races or two classes to reconcile with one another would require every single member of both classes to agree to that, which means a lot of people are going to have to agree to things that they don't want. And all you actually need in either class is one grifter who refuses to agree to reconcile because they can keep extracting power, who then can rise to leadership because they're getting more and more and more for their side. And so that actually the race Marxist and the class-based thinking itself at the bottom of this, just the class stratification of society model, not even the conflict theory part itself, prevents reconciliation of classes. And they said that this, where the thinking goes wrong, is as a matter of fact that thinking that classes can reconcile. It's not. It's individuals who reconcile with individuals. And this is an incredibly important point. But what they're tapping into, in fact, is the same point that Lenin has raised here, which is Lenin is saying these classes cannot reconcile to one another. And so what you have to do not is to figure out ways for individuals to work together within society and secure individual rights. Oh, hell no, that's not what you do. You have to recognize the class and the antagonism of the classes, because that's the intrinsic way that they think, is in class structure. Instead, what you have to do is free up the oppressed class, but not the oppressor class, to be able to do violence in order to revolutionarily reorganize society. And so Daryl and Virgil would be, in this case, considered petty bourgeois politicians or petty bourgeois podcasters or something, or clergy or something, who are trying to force order and individualism into the equation rather than recognizing the necessity of class conflict, which they recognized as the intrinsic flaw of CRT and why it cannot produce its sales pitch of racial reconciliation in the church. So they were spot on. But Lenin wants to give us a different example. He says, for instance, when in the Revolution of 1917, the question of the significance and role of the state arose in all its magnitude as a practical question demanding immediate action, and moreover, action on a mass scale. He's talking about the February 1917 revolution. Don't get confused. There was a February revolution that actually took place in March, and there was an October revolution that actually took place in November. This book was written in between them. So the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks are fighting over power, and the Tsar is trying to depose the Tsar, and the Bolsheviks want to be in charge. So there was the February Revolution earlier in the year, and things didn't go all the way that the Bolsheviks wanted. In fact, Lenin was squeezed out during this period and was not in a position, and so he rallied the Bolsheviks a couple of months. This came out in July or August of 17. By October, November, he was waging his proper revolution and then seized power before the end of the year. So when in the Revolution of 1917, the question of the significance and role of the state arose in all its magnitude as a practical question demanding immediate action, and moreover action on a mass scale, all the social revolutionaries and Mensheviks descended at once to the petty bourgeois theory that the state reconciles classes. Innumerable resolutions and articles by politicians of both these parties are thoroughly saturated with this petty bourgeois and Philistine reconciliation theory. So these are your kind of your rhinos here, by the way. That the state is an organ of the rule of a definite class which cannot be reconciled with its antipode, the class opposite to it, is something the petty bourgeois Democrats will never be able to understand. It's also your rank and file Democrats. So your general, what do we call them, turds, the umpires of reasonable discourse, This is who he's going after. They got the Menshevik attitude. Their attitude to the state is one of the most striking manifestations of the fact that our socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks are not socialists at all, a point that we Bolsheviks have always maintained, but petty bourgeois Democrats using near-socialist phraseology. On the other hand, the Kautskyite distortion of, that's his nemesis for this, the Kautskyite distortion of Marxism is far more subtle. Theoretically, that's in quotes, it is not denied that the state is an organ of class rule or that class antagonisms are irreconcilable, but what is overlooked or glossed over is this. If the state is the product of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms, if it is a power standing above society and, quote, alienating itself more and more from it, that was Engels he's quoting, it is clear that the liberation of the oppressed class is impossible not only without a violent revolution, but also without the destruction of the apparatus of state power which was created by the ruling class and which is the embodiment of this, quote, alienation. As we shall see later, Marx very explicitly drew this theoretically self-evident conclusion on the strength of a concrete historical analysis of the tasks of the revolution, and as we shall show in detail further on, it is this conclusion which Kautsky has, quote, forgotten and distorted. See, Kautsky didn't really forget it. He actually understands it, but he's trying to hide that he understands it, right? So if it is the case, as even this faction seems to understand in agreement with Lenin, if it is the case that there's this alien power standing above society and the state, then not only do you need a violent revolution, which Kautsky has forgotten, but you also need to destroy the apparatus of the state. You can't merely take over the apparatus of the state with all of its, as Herbert Marcuse called it, technological rationality. You actually have to destroy the apparatus of state power, which was created by the ruling class. And he says that this is what they forget. So the Bolsheviks have to come in and completely devastate and destroy the previous hierarchical program and push this so-called radical equality line. Section 2, special bodies of armed men, prisons, etc. Engels continues, quote, as distinct from the old Gentile, tribal, or clan order, the state first divides its subjects according to territory. Lenin elaborates, this division seems natural to us, but it costs a prolonged struggle against the old organization according to generations or tribes. This is a major problem. In fact, this is the roots of DEI. You have all of these clans and tribes throughout the land that you're going to take over, and they, in fact, have different interests that aren't clashing interests. That aren't just down to class. You have this tribe and you have that tribe. They're both tribes of poor-ass peasants. Neither one is wealthier than the other in any way whatsoever, and they have their own antagonisms. That's an issue, and it costs a prolonged struggle against the old organization according to its generations and tribes, he says. So, quoting on from Engels, he says, the second distinguishing feature is the establishment of a public power, which no longer directly coincides with the population organizing itself as an armed force. This special public power is necessary because of a self-acting armed organization of the population has become impossible since the split into classes. The public power exists in every state. It consists not merely of armed men, but also of material adjuncts, prisons, and institutions of coercion of all kinds, of which Gentile clan society knew nothing. End quote. That's the end of the Engels passage here. And so now we're going to talk about power and how power works within the state. And Lenin tells us, Engels elucidates the concept of, quote, power, which is called the state, a power which rose from society but places itself above and alienates itself more and more from it. What does this power mainly consist of? It consists of special bodies of armed men having prisons, etc. at their command. So in practice, that's what the state looks like. He says, we are justified in speaking of special bodies of armed men because the public power, which is an attribute of every state, quote, does not directly coincide with the armed population, with its, quote, self-acting armed organization. Those are Engels quotes. Like all great revolutionary thinkers, Lenin tells us, Engels tries to draw the attention of the class-conscious workers to what prevailing Philistinism regards as least worthy of attention. I'm saying things weird because of big words like prevailing Philistinism. Let me say that again. Engels tries to draw the attention of the class-conscious workers, like all great revolutionary thinkers, to what prevailing Philistinism, that's the people he just complained about, regards as least worthy of attention, as the most habitual thing, hallowed by prejudices that are not only deep-rooted, but one might say petrified. A standing army and police are the chief instruments of state power, but how can it be otherwise? Feels like you have seeds of defund the police there, doesn't it? Yes, of course you do. Everything happening in woke Marxism has a straight line back to Lenin somewhere. Well, here's what Lenin explains. From the viewpoint of the vast majority of Europeans at the end of the 19th century, whom Engels was addressing and who had not gone through or closely observed a single great revolution, it could not have been otherwise. They could not understand at all what a, quote, self-acting armed organization of the population was. When asked why it became necessary to have special bodies of armed men placed above society and alienating themselves from it, police and a standing army, the West European and Russian Philistines are inclined to utter a few phrases borrowed from Spencer of Makielowski to refer to the growing complexity of social life, the differentiation of functions, and so on. Such a reference seems scientific and effectively lulls the ordinary person to sleep by obscuring the important and basic fact, namely the split of society into irreconcilable antagonistic classes. Were it not for this split, the, quote, self-acting armed organization of the population would differ from the primitive organization of a stick-wielding herd of monkeys, or of primitive men, or of men united in clans by its complexity, its high technical level, and so on, but such an organization would still be possible. It is impossible because civilized society is split into antagonistic and moreover irreconcilably antagonistic classes whose, quote, self-acting army would lead to an armed struggle between them. See, I told you Lenin's so kind of straightforward. I don't have to do a lot of explaining to you what in the hell he's talking about. A state arises, he says. A special power is created. Special bodies of armed men, and every revolution, by destroying the state apparatus, shows us the naked class struggle, clearly shows us how the ruling class strives to restore the special bodies of armed men which serve it, and how the oppressed class strives to create a new organization of this kind, capable of serving the exploited instead of the exploiters. It's almost like he has a grasp on how all this is going to go sideways. In the above argument, Engels, he tells us, raises theoretically the very same question which every great revolution raises before us in practice, palpably, and what is more, on a scale of mass action, namely the question of the relationship between, quote, special bodies of armed men and the, quote, self-acting armed organization of the population. We shall see, he says, how this question is specifically illustrated by the experience of the European and Russian revolutions. But, to return to Engels' exposition, he points out that sometimes, in certain parts of North America, for example, the public power is weak. He has in mind a rare exception in capitalist society, and those parts of North America in its pre-imperialist days where the free colonists predominated, but that generally speaking, it grows stronger. Quote, the public power, grows stronger, however, in proportion as class antagonisms within the state become more acute, and as adjacent states become larger and more populous. We have only to look at our present-day Europe, where class struggle and rivalry and conquest have tuned up the public power to such a pitch that it threatens to swallow the whole of society and even the state. End quote. This, Lenin tells us, was written not later than the early 90s of the last century, so the 1890s, early 1890s. Engels' last preface being dated June 16, 1891. The turn toward imperialism, meaning the complete domination of the trusts, the omnipotence of the big banks, and a grand-scale colonial policy, and so forth, sounds like the World Economic Forum, was only just beginning in France and was even weaker in North America and in Germany. Since then, quote, rivalry in conquest has taken a gigantic stride, all the more because by the beginning of the second decade of the 20th century, so by 1910, the world had been completely divided up among those, quote, rivals in conquest, that is, among the predatory great powers. Since then, military and naval armaments have grown fantastically, and the predatory war of 1914 to 1917 for the domination of the world by Britain or Germany for the division of the spoils has brought the swallowing of all the forces of society by the rapacious state power close to complete catastrophe. He's talking about World War I there, in case you're not sure. Which he characterizes. How does he characterize World War I? Let's just draw that out. The predatory war of 1914 through 1917 for the domination of the world by Britain or Germany and for the division of the spoils. That's how he characterizes World War I. We'll just let that percolate. Engels, he tells us, could as early as 1891 point to rivalry and conquest as one of the most important distinguishing features of the foreign policy of the great powers, while the social chauvinist scoundrels have ever since 1914, when this rivalry many times intensified, gave rise to an imperialist war, have been covering up the defense of the predatory interests of their own bourgeoisie with phrases about defense of the fatherland, defense of the republic and the revolution, etc. So that's a take on the World War I that I believe, the Great War, that I believe people today might even resonate with a little bit, but you have to remember that Lenin is leveraging it. He is not actually necessarily subscribing to it. He's leveraging it to say that what we need is a completely different order where these world powers don't work like that. These great powers, I should say. So these great capitalist powers fighting for one another, rivals in conquest for the great imperial power of the world. By the way, what did the Soviet Union try to do? What has communism been trying to do ever since? Yeah, the iron law of woke projection never misses. But he's trying to claim that if we all had, of course, the same viewpoint, if we were all socialist, if we were all on the same page, there would be no rivalry and conquest. We would be in agreement. We would be allies. We would all be allies. It would all be kumbaya, country to country, and we would all be helping one another out. But it's because we have great capitalist powers trying to wage imperialist wars and to divide up the loot among them, or put less viciously, we have great rising powers that are capitalist in orientation who are trying their best to secure the largest number of advantages for their own citizens and defend them, which we learned through the 20th century looking at A, World War I, B, World War II, C, Cold War, which proved that it wasn't actually the deal. We could throw in other wars like Korean War, the Sino-Japanese War. We could throw in other wars and see that, in fact, the socialists are not immune to this, as Lenin is kind of insinuating either. Section 3. The state, an instrument for the exploitation of the oppressed class. So he just cuts all through it. The state exists to maintain the exploitation of oppressed classes. That's going to be his argument, which means that they have every right to rebel against the state. As Mao put it later, to rebel is justified. That was one of the chants of the Cultural Revolution. They're going to rebel against the state. They're going to destroy the existing state apparatus, and they're going to institute a completely new state apparatus in line with the socialist program, which just so happens to be something very much like a Platonic tyranny run by the vanguard of the proletariat, and at least in Leninist theory, or Marxism-Leninism. Here's how Lenin describes it. He says, the maintenance of the special public power standing above society, remember that's the state, with police and an army, requires taxes and state loans. So I'm not positive who he's quoting here, but he has a long quote, but it references Engels, so I assume it's not Engels, but it says, quote, having the power and the right to levy taxes, Engels writes, the officials now stand as organs of society above society. The free voluntary respect that was accorded the organs of the Gentile clan constitution does not satisfy them, even if they could gain it. end quote. So that's the part where somebody's quoting Engels. Special laws are enacted, it's probably Marx, but I'm not positive who it is. Maybe it tells us in the next paragraph or something. But special laws are enacted proclaiming the sanctity and immunity of the officials. Quote, the shabbiest police servant, end quote, has more authority than the representative of the clan, and even the head of the military power of a civilized state may well envy the elder of a clan of the, quote, unrestrained respect of society. So that's the quote that he uses to set the table here. And he says, the question of the privileged position of the officials as organs of state power is raised here. The main point indicated is, what is it that places them above society? We shall see how this theoretical question was answered in practice by the Paris Commune in 1871, and how it was obscured from a reactionary standpoint by Kautsky, that's his rival, in 1912. Here's another quote. I do not know who this is quoting. Because the state arose from the need to hold class antagonisms in check, it's probably Engels, but I'm not positive. But because it arose at the same time in the midst of the conflict of these classes, it is as a rule the state of the most powerful economically dominant class. So the state arises to be the state as a toy of the economic powerful classes, right? Why? Because the state arose from the need to hold class antagonisms in check, so we're not going to have violent revolution against the ruling class, but because it arose at the same time in the midst of the conflict of these classes, it is as a rule the state of the most powerful economically dominant class, which through the medium of the state becomes also the politically dominant class, and thus acquires new means of holding down and exploiting the oppressed class. Okay, so that's where the state comes from. It's not just that you have a state arise amongst the people because of the irreconcilability of class conflict. You actually have the state arise from within the powerful interests of that society to make sure that their interests are protected from the lower class. So they are oppressive, and then they institute a state to maintain their ability to do oppression. That's his thesis. This quote continues, the ancient and feudal states were organs for the exploitation of the slaves and the serfs. Likewise, the modern representative state is an instrument of exploitation of wage labor by capital. By way of exception, however, periods occur in which the warring classes balance each other so nearly that the state power as ostensible mediator acquires for the moment a certain degree of independence of both. Such were the absolute monarchies of the 17th and 18th century, the Bonapartism of the First and Second Empires in France, and the Bismarck regime in Germany. End quote. Lenin goes on. Such, we may add, is the Kerensky government in the Republican Russia, since it began to persecute the revolutionary proletariat, at a moment when, owing to the leadership of the petty bourgeois Democrats, the Soviets have already become impotent, while the bourgeoisie are not yet strong enough simply to disperse them. In a democratic republic, Engels continues, quote, wealth exercises its power indirectly, but all the more surely, end quote. First, he says, by means of the, quote, direct corruption of officials, as in America. Secondly, by means of an alliance of the government and the stock exchange, as in both France and America. Lenin explains, at present, imperialism and the domination of the banks have developed, that's in quotes, quote, developed into an exceptional art, both these methods of upholding and giving effect to the omnipotence of wealth in democratic republics of all descriptions. Since, for instance, in the very first months of the Russian Democratic Republic, one might say during the honeymoon of the, quote, socialist, social revolutionaries and Mensheviks joined in wedlock to the bourgeoisie in the coalition government, Mr. Palchinsky obstructed every measure intended for curbing the capitalists and their marauding practices, their plundering of the state by means of war contracts, and since later on Mr. Palchinsky, upon resigning from the cabinet and being, of course, replaced by another quite similar Palchinsky, was, quote, rewarded by the capitalists with a lucrative job with a salary of 120,000 rubles per annum, What would you call that? Direct or indirect bribery? An alliance of the government and the syndicates, or merely friendly relations? What role do the Chernovs, Tseretellis, Jesus, I can't say Russian names this fast, Avkensentievs, something, and Skobalevs play? Are they direct or only the indirect allies of the millionaire treasury looters? So you're saying what he's saying is that when you don't actually have this full-blown revolution and take over with a enlightened vanguard, what you end up with is corruption. And that here's this huge example of corruptions, and here's how they work in America and France, and here you have this midway, I should say, half-measure faux socialist government that took over in Russia that's not doing it. This is some inside baseball Russian politics, but he's saying basically that the capitalists are going to always try to buy this off, which is another reason you're going to have to destroy everything, drawing off of Engels and watching it play out in practice. Another reason why the omnipotence of wealth is more certain in a democratic republic is that it does not depend on defects in the political machinery or on the faulty political shell of capitalism, so says Lenin. A democratic republic is it's not. A democratic republic is the best possible political shell for capitalism, and therefore, once capital has gained possession of this very best shell through the Pelchinskys, Chernovs, Tseretellis, and company, it establishes its power so securely, so firmly, that no change of persons, institutions, or parties in the bourgeois democratic republic can shake it. So he says that the democratic republic, the model of governance that we have here, is the best possible shell for capitalism. So if you want to have capitalism or a market economy that succeeds, it's the best way. But unfortunately, once capital has gained possession of the best shell itself, so in other words, capitalism will eventually buy its own government, buy its republic, and take control, creating an oligarchy that establishes its power so firmly and powerfully and securely that nobody could possibly change it. And that's what he's trying to describe as the problem that's seized Russia due to the traitors of the Mensheviks. Why can I not say Mensheviks? Pardon me. He says we must also note that Engels is most explicit in calling universal suffrage as well an instrument of bourgeois rule. Wait a minute. I thought communists were for expanding the vote to everybody, no voter ID and all that, right? Universal suffrage as well is being called by Engels. We must also note that Engels is most explicit in calling universal suffrage as well an instrument of bourgeois rule. Universal suffrage, he says, obviously taking account of the long experience of German social democracy, is, quote, the gauge of the maturity of the working class. It cannot and never will be anything more in the present day state, end quote. Here he explains. The petty bourgeois Democrats, such as our socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks, and also their twin brothers, all the social chauvinists and opportunists of Western Europe, expect this, quote, more from universal suffrage. They themselves share and instill into the minds of the people the false notion that universal suffrage in the present-day state is really capable of revealing the will of the majority of the working people and of securing its realization. So here, do you understand what he's talking about here? He's saying that letting everybody vote does not actually give everybody a voice. That's not the view of the Leninists, as you understand already. And this is where you start to see the ominous parallels to today, right? Here he says we can only indicate this false notion, only point out that Engels' perfectly clear statement is distorted at every step in the propaganda and agitation of the official, that is, opportunist, socialist parties. A detailed exposure of the utter falsity of this notion, which Engels brushes aside here, is given in our further account of the views of Marx and Engels on the present-day state. Engels gives a general summary of his views in the most popular of his works in the following words. The state, then, this is Engels, has not existed from all eternity. There have been societies that did without it, that had no idea of the state and state power. At a certain stage of economic development, which was necessarily bound up with the split of society into classes, the state became a necessity. Owing to this split, we are now rapidly approaching a stage in the development of production at which the existence of these classes will not only will have ceased to be a necessity, but will become a positive hindrance to production. They will fall as they arose at an earlier stage. Along with them, the state will inevitably fall. Society, which will reorganize production on the basis of a free and equal association of the producers, will put the whole machinery of the state where it will then belong, into a museum of antiquities by the side of the spinning wheel and the bronze axe. End quote. So Engels is optimistic in thinking that the state is going to go obsolete, and it will go obsolete as literally, it says, as the apparatus itself, as the antagonisms between the producers and the workers become so big that that the state itself, or that this antagonism becomes a hindrance to production. So what will happen is that these classes will fall exactly as they arose, and along with them the state, which maintains their state of antagonism, will also fall. In other words, the socialist revolution is inevitable, it's coming, and it will make the state obsolete. So Lenin remarks, "We do not often come across this passage in the propaganda and agitation literature of the present-day social democrats. Even when we do come across it, it is mostly quoted in the same manner as one bows before an icon. That is, it is done to show official respect for Engels, and no attempt is made to gauge the breadth and depth of the revolution that this relegating of, quote, the whole machinery of state to a museum of antiquities implies. In most cases, we do not even find an understanding of what Engels calls the state machine." So, section 4, the withering away of the state and violent revolution. Notice the table's now been set that universal suffrage is a problem. It makes itself look like a solution. It's the solution of people who don't get it, but that we need something different. Universal suffrage isn't going to do it. Not only are we going to need a violent revolution, we're also going to have to not have universal suffrage. In other words, certain people who have too much voice now are going to have to lose their voice, which is what chapter 5 of this book is actually about in depth, which is the one that we read in the previous episode about Lenin. Engels' words, section 4 here, Engels' words regarding the, quote, withering away of the state are so widely known, they are so often quoted and so clearly reveal the essence of the customary application of Marxism to opportunism that we must deal with them in detail. We shall quote the whole argument from which they are taken, and this is a very long quote, I think longer than a page from Engels. This is Engels. "The proletariat seizes from state power and turns the means of production into state property to begin with. But thereby it abolishes itself as the proletariat, abolishes all class distinctions and class antagonisms, and abolishes also the state as state." So that's beginning. Let's take this apart. So the proletariat is the working class that's actually become kind of a galvanized revolutionary force, right? And it seizes from state power and turns the means of production into state property. Okay? So when the proletariat they're not just the workers now, but they're also the bosses and the owners because they've seized everything, right? And they're using this to do the means of production as state property. In that action, because now there's not the owner class and then the worker class. There's just the worker class that also owns the means of production. So there's just a worker class that owns everything involved, right? So you've abolished the antagonistic class. You've abolished the oppressor class because now the ownership is completed not by an owner class, but by the proletariat itself. So the owners and the workers are the same people. So when that happens, it thereby, Engels tells us, abolishes itself as the proletariat. The proletariat's not the proletariat anymore. And of course, we've talked in the past about how George Lukács explored in History and Class Consciousness that this is a harder thing to have happen than Marx and Engels predicted. That there is something going on, that was written in 1923, by the way. There was something going on where once the proletariat goes to seize power, it's so ensconced in class thinking that it can't give up class thinking. But if it were still just the workers now own all the means of production by expropriating the expropriators, as Marx put it, the proletariat would abolish itself as a proletariat, because there is no worker working for the man. That's what the proletariat is, because they are the man too. And so it therefore also abolishes all class distinctions. And if there's no class distinctions, how can there be a conflict between them? So it also abolishes all class antagonisms. But then if there's no class antagonisms that are irreconcilable, there are no class antagonisms, you don't need a state to manage them. So that would also abolish the state as state. So this is Engels' argument. Now there's going to be some fast talking going on by Lenin on this later, but I want you to pay attention to that, right? The idea is that when the proletariat seizes power, it's not that there are not two classes anymore, so there's not a class antagonism, so thus there's no need for a state, and so the state is no longer a state. This is where he's going to come up with this concept of a semi-state that runs the socialist government, because it's a state in how it functions in terms of being a power that's above society and enforces stuff with a police and a military, but it's also not a state because it's this, right? It's just one single class, so it's not upholding a class antagonism. Of course, this is just a major lie communists tell themselves. And then they say it wasn't real communism later because the state never actually abolished itself as state. But Lenin's going to let that phrasing, state as state, it abolishes it also abolishes the state as state. So those last two words, as state. So it's still there, but it's something different. That's the room that Lenin is going to discover in order to push his vanguard party model of the socialist government. But let's let Engels speak, because he says this argument is very clear and complete. Society thus far, Engels tells us, operating amid class antagonisms, needed the state, that is, an organization of the particular exploiting class, for the maintenance of its external conditions of production, and therefore especially for the purpose of forcibly keeping the exploited class in the conditions of oppression determined by the given mode of production, slavery, serfdom, or bondage, or wage labor. Remember, their belief is that the whole purpose of the state in these productive modes, slavery, feudal, or capitalist, is to keep the oppressed doing their jobs as such, as slaves, as serfs, or as wage slaves or wage laborers. Engels goes on, the state was the official representative of society as a whole, its concentration in a visible corporation, but it was this only insofar as it was the state of that class which itself represented for its own time society as a whole. So only the ruling class actually had the state, and therefore the state isn't actually a representation of society as a whole. It's only a representation of the ruling class. That's the argument. The official representative of society as a whole, its concentration in a visible corporation. Oh, sorry, I already read that part. But it was this only insofar as it was the state of that class which itself represented for its own time society as a whole. In ancient times, the state of slave-owning citizens, in the Middle Ages of the feudal nobility, in our own time of the bourgeoisie, which I remind you is the middle class. When at last it becomes the real representative of the whole society. So when the state becomes a real representative of the whole society, right? When it's an inclusive democracy, to use modern language. When it at last becomes the real representative of the whole of society, it renders itself unnecessary. As soon as there is no longer any social class to be held in subjection, as soon as class rule and the individual's struggle for existence based on the present anarchy in production, with the collisions and excesses arising from this struggle are removed, nothing more remains to be held in subjection, nothing necessitating a special coercive force, that is, a state. In the first act by which the state really comes forward as the representative of the whole society, the taking possession of the means of production in the name of society, Notice how much work in the name of society is doing there, right? So there's your token problem that you always see. The workers and the peasants are tokens of these communist regimes, these vanguard parties like Lenin's, Bolsheviks, or Communist Party, Stalin, Mao, and so on. So let's go back to the argument. We have to go back a long way to make sense of this. Or no, we don't, sorry. So what he's saying is that the whole quality of what was the state transforms when you get de facto class abolition by the proletariat expropriating the bourgeoisie and taking control of the means of production. He says the first act by which the state really comes forward as a representative of the whole of society is the taking possession of the means of production in the name of society. That is also its last independent act as a state. So it's no longer a state after that. State interference, Engels tells us, in social relations becomes in one domain after another superfluous and then dies down of itself. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things, which is going to require a council that understands the correct administration of them. The word for council in Russian is Soviet. So you're about to see where he's extracting the Soviet model from this. And by the conduct of processes of production, the state is not, quote, abolished, it withers away. This gives the measure of, so it was abolished as state, and then what's left withers away. That's the argument Lenin is going to make. This gives the measure of the value of the phrase, a free people's state, both as to its justifiable use for a long time from an agitational point of view. In other words, they're calling it a free people's state, specifically as an agitational. In other words, as a way to work people up, to get them to do activism for it. This gives the measure of the value of the phrase a free people's state, both as to its justifiable use for a long time from an agitational point of view, and as to its ultimate scientific insufficiency, and also of the so-called anarchists' demand that the state be abolished overnight. And this is, from what I understand, in Anti-Düring, where Engels wrote this, which is a rant about Jugenddüring. It's quite the rant. Means Mr. or man. It is safe to say, Lenin tells us, that of this argument of Engels, which is so remarkably rich in ideas, only one point has become an integral part of socialist thought among modern socialist parties, namely that according to Marx that the state, quote, withers away, as distinct from the anarchist doctrine of the abolition of the state. To prune Marxism to such an extent means reducing it to opportunism, for this, quote, interpretation only leaves a vague notion of slow, even gradual change, of absence of leaps and storms, of absence of revolution. The current widespread, popular, if one must say so, conception of the, quote, withering away of the state undoubtedly means obscuring, if not repudiating, revolution. So Lenin's case here is that the people who talk about this withering away of the state are jumping the gun. He says that that Engels makes it really clear you have to have a revolution first, then the state can start to wither away, because once the revolution occurs, the workers' revolution, the state is no longer state as state. It's something that can wither away. So state, as the thing that maintains capitalist class antagonism, will be abolished by a violent revolution. Then what's left afterwards, which Lenin calls a semi-state, will then wither away of its own accord. And Lenin's not happy about people thinking the withering away is something that happens without a revolution. Notice that these are literally societal eschatological arguments. They're fighting over the end times of the existing society. Are we pre-mill or post-mill? It's basically the same argument. Such an interpretation, he puts interpretations in quotes, he does not like that as an interpretation. Lenin, such an interpretation, however, is the crudest distortion of Marxism, advantageous only to the bourgeoisie. In point of theory, it is based on disregard for the most important circumstances and considerations indicated in, say, Engels' summary argument we have just quoted in full. In the first place, at the very outset of his argument, Engels says that in seizing state power, the proletariat thereby abolishes the state as state. It is not done to ponder over the... there's a typo in the thing. It is not done to ponder over the meaning of this. Generally, meaning people don't care what that means, right? In the first place, the very outset of his argument, Engels says that in seizing state power, the proletariat thereby abolishes the state as state. And he said it is not done. People do not care to ponder over the meaning of this. Generally, it is either ignored altogether or it is considered something in the nature of Hegelian weakness on Engels' part. As a matter of fact, however, these words briefly express the experience of one of the greatest proletarian revolutions, the Paris Commune of 1871, of which we shall speak in greater detail in its proper place. As a matter of fact, Engels speaks here of the proletariat revolution abolishing the bourgeois state, while the words about the state withering away refer to the remnants of the proletarian state after the socialist revolution. According to Engels, the bourgeois state does not wither away, but is abolished by the proletariat in the course of the revolution. What withers away after this revolution is the proletarian state, or semi-state. So did you follow? Everything I said before that paragraph is there delivered to you in very clear language, but let's be clear about the little trick he pulls here. The thing that we have that we call a state, say the government of the United States of America or Canada or whatever, when it is not already having gone through a violent revolution, socialist revolution, when that hasn't occurred, now, of course, we're dealing with a less Marxist and more Fabian model of government infiltration, so you could argue that Canada's already gone and America's close, but before the means of production are taken, are seized by the socialists, before that happens, you have a state that is designed to maintain existing class antagonisms. Lenin's critique of what we're seeing happen through this Fabian infiltration, and Lenin and the Fabians did not agree about this. They fought about this. H.G. Wells, as a famous member of the famous Fabian Society, interviewed Lenin and wrote quite a disparaging piece about him as a result of this disagreement. Lenin has already said that if you do this infiltration stuff, so the Fabians would be opportunists in his definition, if you did this infiltration stuff and don't abolish the form of the state itself, you're just going to repeat what the state does. It must be abolished by the proletariat in the course of the revolution. And then what's left over is no longer a state because there are not technically different classes anymore. What does that mean? So long as, this is so important to understand, this is communist vanguard logic, and this is the result, this is the cause of 200 or so million deaths and God knows how much destruction across the 20th century in 20th century communism. So long as the capitalist class exists, even in spirit, even in hidden away values that haven't been transformed, so long as that still exists, the state can't wither away because the state has to exist to maintain class antagonisms. What then will the semi-state do? What is its most important job? It's not just to use the inversion of praxis to force people to become socialist, because when everybody is a truly transformed communist, then it'll work. It is to destroy all vestiges of capitalist belief. All capitalists, all capitalist beliefs, all capitalist values, all capitalist attitudes must be destroyed. That becomes the primary role for the semi-state, which is the dictatorship of the proletariat that is established in the abolition of the capitalist state. And now he explains. Secondly, so this is why the communist regimes of the 20th century were the way that they were. The communist regime of the 21st century is more coercive and less directly violent. Look at what happens in China. They use social credit to contour people's behaviors. It's more of the inversion of praxis. They're going to invert the praxis of Marxism into society by forcing people to participate along with it until they're transformed, because that's just what it is. But here's how this works in the 20th century under the Leninist model. Secondly, Lenin tells us the state is a, quote, special coercive force. Engels gives us this splendid and extremely profound definition here with the utmost lucidity, he says. And from it follows that the special coercive force for the suppression of the proletariat by the bourgeoisie, that's in your bourgeois state, that's in capitalist countries, your special coercive force for the suppression of the proletariat by the bourgeoisie of millions of working people by handfuls of the rich must be replaced by a special coercive force for the suppression of the bourgeoisie by the proletariat. That's called the dictatorship of the proletariat. And this is precisely what is meant by, quote, abolition of the state as state. You're going to get rid of a republican democracy, and you're going to replace it with a dictatorship of the proletariat that has the key job of being a special coercive force for the suppression of the bourgeoisie by the proletariat through the dictatorship of the proletariat. And he says again, this is precisely what is meant by the abolition of the state as state. When you have the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is a totalitarian dictatorship operating in the name of the proletariat. Remember, he said in the name of. In the name of. Imagine getting that wrong. Imagine using them as tokens. Imagine being psychopaths, using the workers or the racial minorities or the sexual minorities merely as tokens to advance a destructive radical agenda that puts you in power. This is precisely what is meant by the abolition of state as state. This is precisely the act of taking possession of the means of production in the name of society. He repeated it. In the name of society. Taking control in the name of society. Not necessarily literally in the name of. Now again, he's a communist lunatic. He probably believed it. He probably did not think he was tokenizing these people. He probably thought he knew better than them what they really need, that they did not understand their own interests, and therefore, since they don't understand their own interests, he and the vanguard will bring about the conditions that are in their own interest. It only killed tens of millions of them and ruined the lives of almost every one of them that was there for 70 years. And Lenin goes on. And it is self-evident that such a replacement of one bourgeois special force by another proletarian special force cannot possibly take place in the form of withering away. Because the bourgeois special force, the state and its apparatuses like police and military, won't let you. They won't just let you march in and take over the government. They're going to resist you. So you're going to have to do it in a violent revolution. When the proletariat takes over, it's something different. Thirdly, it's a dictatorship that's in the name of the people. Think of the People's Republic of China, right? Soviet Union didn't have people there in the name, but we can think of the People's Republic of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, right? And we can think about, all of these Republic of this, Republic of that, People's this, People's Republic of that, People's Republic of Norman, Oklahoma. We can think of all of these People's Republics, right? In the name of the people. Destroying the people, sure, but it's done in the name of the people, and that's the point of the dictatorship of the proletariat, is that it's a dictatorship by as Lenin explained elsewhere, led by the greatest theoreticians, by basically the faculty of Harvard University, the greatest and most advanced theoreticians, the party itself, in the name of. So they'll speak for you for your needs because you don't know your needs. You stupid, oppressed people. And when it's in the name of them, then it's not a state anymore, because even though it's like really a super powerful tyranny, totalitarian state, even though it's that, it's not a state because it's being done in the name of the people. And everything I'm reading this, the history of Mao Zedong right now and his time in power, and it was all done in the name of the people, but it was all just excuses for more power for the party in the name of the people. When Mao wanted something done and a lot of people killed, he said that the people that he was killing were suppressing the views of the people. It was pretty astonishing. Thirdly, Lenin tells us, in speaking of the state, quote, withering away, in and the even more graphic and colorful dying down of itself, Engels refers quite clearly and definitively to the period after, quote, the state has taken possession of the means of production in the name of the whole of society. Again and again, in the name of. That is, after the socialist revolution. We all know that the political form of the state at that time is the most complete democracy. And state is in quotes. Let me reread that sentence. We all know after the dictatorship of the proletariat is established, after the socialist revolution, he says, we all know that the political form of the, quote, state at that time is the most complete democracy. Holy shit. Can you even imagine? But it never enters the head. But of course, that's exactly, Kamala Harris tweeted today, as of the time I'm recording this, that she's going to be president for all people. For all Americans, right? She's going to be president for all Americans, which of course is the old for all trick of communists, where they're assuming the underlying hidden premise that we must reject is that some Americans are not represented by, say, Donald Trump as president or some other president, or haven't been historically represented. So it's a justification for an equity campaign, a redistribution campaign. That's the exact same idea. What Kamala Harris is saying when she says she's going to be president for all Americans is the exact same thing that Lenin is saying when he says, we all know that the political form of the state at that time is the most complete democracy. But it never enters the head of any of the opportunists, Lenin says, who shamelessly distort Marxism, that Engels is consequently speaking here of democracy dying down of itself or withering away. This seems very strange at first sight, but it is incomprehensible only to those who have not thought about democracy also being a state and consequently also disappearing when the state disappears. Revolution alone can abolish the bourgeois state, and the state in general, that is the most complete democracy, can only wither away. Fourthly, after formulating his famous proposition that the state withers away, Engels at once explains specifically that this proposition is directed against both the opportunists and the anarchists. In doing this, Engels puts in the forefront that conclusion drawn from the proposition that the state withers away, which is directed against the opportunists. Okay, so let me summarize what these points do, especially that third one we just talked about, and I didn't say much about it. What he's saying is that after the socialist revolution happens, the thing that you have is no longer technically a state. He called it a semi-state, and that thing will wither away because it is a most complete democracy in which there is no longer a class antagonism, because there are not two classes, because the bourgeois class has been expropriated. It's been destroyed. When you've stamped out all vestiges of bourgeois society, when you've stamped out the bourgeoisie completely, there is but one class. And that will naturally wither away according to its lack of need, because when there's only one class, there's no class antagonism. If there's no class antagonism, there's no need for a state to maintain class antagonism to the advantage of the ruling class. So eventually, you're just not going to need a state. But what do you need this semi-state, this dictatorship of the proletariat for in the meantime? Getting rid of the bourgeois elements of society in every facet. Every bit of inequality, every bit of attitude like you should be able to have the fruits of your labor, that all has to be destroyed. And that's the purpose of this. And that thing, that totalitarian monster, will naturally wither away when? To the degree that it has succeeded in destroying the bourgeoisie. So as it stamps out the bourgeoisie more and more and more, it will wither away because it becomes less and less necessary because there's just one class and everybody's interests within that class align. Isn't that retarded? Isn't it just stupid to think that every individual's interests will align because they're all members of one class and you get there by destroying the opposing class? And now you can see why communists hate class enemies so much. Why everything they do is designed to antagonize, draw out, and then destroy class enemies. Because that's how they believe it works. When everybody's just a member of one class, they all have exactly the same interests. Because they all have the interests, they have no conflicting interests. And because they have no conflicting interests, you don't need a state to administer between them. And you have a stateless society. But you also have a classless society, because if everything's one class, there are no classes, so there is no class society, so there's no classes. So you have a stateless, classless society where everything apparently works. That's the vision. That's the view. That's the Isn't that ridiculous, though? And so why is communism so destructive? Because it believes that the only way to get there is to destroy the previous ruling class, to destroy it with a vigorous dictatorship of the proletariat that does all of its destruction in the name of the masses. Now, here's the really twisted part. What happens when this obviously isn't going to work? What happens when it doesn't work? Well, it didn't work because what? Well, if it was all just one class with all aligned class interests, it would work because there must still be vestiges of the bourgeois class, the old class, the bad class. It must still be there somewhere. So then what are you going to do? Well, you have to find it. You have to find it and get rid of it. So you have to root it out. So you have to go on a purge or a witch hunt, or you have to run a campaign to draw them out and destroy them. Or you have to start making up reasons why it's not working. Communism itself can't be wrong. The model can't be wrong. It can only be implemented incorrectly, and somebody must have implemented it wrong. And the reason they must have implemented it wrong is because they're holding out with old class values. And there you have the explanation for every purge, every destructive decision, every downward spiral into catastrophe of every communist country in history. That right there is the key. And here it comes directly out of Lenin, drawing straight off of Engels. And I don't think he's drawing off incorrectly. And this is how they operate. This is how it must operate. And this is how even our kinder, gentler social credit-based system of 21st century communism will necessarily have to operate. Because when it's not working, when everything isn't working right, in the new system that they think must work perfectly, it must be because somebody, many people out there, still haven't had a transformation of their internal values to align with the system, creating diverse interests, which create diverse class interests, which produce the conflict that requires their management. And their management under a capitalist system is to maintain that and keep it going, and their management under the socialist dictatorship of the proletariat is to destroy them. And that's what will have to happen. They will have to be found, they will have to be re-educated, and when the re-education is not sufficient to make it work, as that's the measurement, they will have to be destroyed. We can look forward to that if we don't put a stop to this development, even with this kinder, gentler kind where power flows from the receiving end of an algorithm rather than, as Mao put it, from the barrel of a gun. So let's go back to Lenin ranting about this, because that was some good points right there. Lenin says, one can wager that out of every 10,000 persons who have read or heard about the withering away of the state, 9,990 are completely unaware or do not remember that Engels directed his conclusions from that proposition not against anarchists alone, meaning also against opportunists, if you remember. And of the remaining 10, probably 9 do not know the meaning of a, quote, free people's state, or why an attack on this slogan means an attack on opportunists. This is how history is written. This is how a great revolutionary teaching is imperceptibly falsified and adapted to prevailing Philistinism. The conclusion directed against the anarchists has been repeated thousands of times. It has been vulgarized and rammed into people's heads in the shallowest form, and has acquired the strength of a prejudice, whereas the conclusions directed against the opportunists has been obscured and forgotten. So guess who he's going to raise an awful lot of rage and ire and violence against? The opportunists, like the Mensheviks. The Free People's State, he said, was a program, demand, and a catchword current among the German Social Democrats in the 70s, meaning the 1870s. This catchword is devoid of all political content except Free People's State, except that it describes the concept of democracy in a pompous Philistine fashion, insofar as it hinted in a legally permissible manner at a democratic republic. Engels was prepared to justify its use for a time from an agitational point of view. In other words, yeah, let's use it as a slogan to get people worked up and join our cause, but it's not what we're really doing. In other words, let's just lie to people to get them on board. He says, But it was also an opportunist catchword, for it amounted to something more than prettifying bourgeois democracy, and was also failure to understand the socialist criticism of the state in general. That is, that it always upholds the antagonism of contending classes and protects the oppressor class by default. We are in favor of a democratic republic, he said, as the best form of state for the proletariat under capitalism, but we have no right to forget that wage slavery is the lot of the people even in the most democratic bourgeois republic. Furthermore, every state is a special force for the suppression of the oppressed class. Consequently, every state is not free and not a people's state. See that? So free people's state was always a lie that they used to agitate, in other words, to recruit, but it was always something at odds with their theory, and that's what he's trying to point out here. Marx and Engels explain this repeatedly to their party comrades in the 1870s. Fifthly, the same work of Engels, whose argument about the withering away of the state everyone remembers, also contains an argument of the significance of violent revolution. Engels' historical analysis of its role becomes a veritable panegyric on violent revolution. This no one remembers. It is not done in modern socialist parties to talk or even think about the significance of this idea, and it plays no part whatever in their daily propaganda and agitation among the people, and yet it is inseparably bound up with the withering away of the state into one harmonious whole. So what's fifthly, what is he saying? He's saying violent revolution is necessary to abolish the capitalist state or the feudal state, in other words, the state as state, and to establish the dictatorship of the proletariat. But nobody remembers that. Nobody wants to talk about that. So nobody agitates anymore, he's saying, for violent revolution. So from the 1870s, when Marx and Engels were agitating for violent revolution, until 1917, something changed and all the socialists went soft. That's what he's saying. They think that you can get to the withering away of the state without the violent revolution. And he's saying, no, you've got to have the violent revolution first. Here is Engels' argument, as Lenin gives it. That force, however, plays yet another role other than that of a diabolical power in history, a revolutionary role. That, in the words of Marx, it is the midwife of every old society which is pregnant with a new one, that it is the instrument with which social movements force their way through and shatter the dead fossilized political forms. Of this there is not a word in Herr Düring, so he's quoting from Anti-Düring. It is only with sighs and groans that he admits the possibility that force will perhaps be necessary for the overthrow of an economy based on exploitation. Unfortunately, because all use of force demoralizes, he says, the person who uses it. And this in Germany, where a violent collision, which may after all be forced on the people, would at least have the advantage of wiping out the servility which has penetrated the nation's mentality following the humiliation of the 30 Years' War. And this person's mode of thought, dull, insipid, and impotent, presumes to impose itself on the most revolutionary party that history has ever known. Lenin comments, how can this panegyric, or panegyric? Anyway, I don't know the pronunciation of this word. How can this panegyric on violent revolution, which Engels insistently brought to the attention of the German Social Democrats between 1878 and 1894, that is right up to the time of his death, be combined with the theory of the withering away of the state to form a single theory? Usually, he says, the two are combined by means of eclecticism, by an unprincipled or sophistic selection made arbitrarily or to please the powers that be, of first one then another argument. And in 99 cases out of 100, if not more, it is the idea of the withering away that is placed in the forefront. Dialectics are replaced by eclecticism. This is the most usual, the most widespread practice to be met with in present-day official social democratic literature in relation to Marxism. This sort of substitution is, of course, nothing new. So Lenin is saying the reason Marxism hasn't worked, by the way, is because it went soft in the years in between when Marx and Engels were agitating for it, and when he's writing in 1917, and it forgot that it has to have a violent revolution first. This sort of substitution is, of course, nothing new. It was observed even in the history of classical Greek philosophy. In falsifying Marxism in opportunist fashion, the substitution of eclecticism for dialectics. I wonder if he's talking about Plato and all of the weirdo stuff in there. In falsifying Marxism in opportunist fashion, the substitution of eclecticism for dialectics, notice it's the dialectic that matters here, right, is the easiest way of deceiving the people. It gives an illusory satisfaction. It seems to take into account all sides of the process, all trends of development, all the conflicting influences and so forth, whereas in reality it provides no integral and revolutionary conception of the process of social development at all. We have already said above, and shall show more fully later, that the theory of Marx and Engels of the inevitability of a violent revolution refers to the bourgeois state. The latter cannot be superseded by the proletarian state, the dictatorship of the proletariat, through the process of withering away, but as a general rule, only through a violent revolution. The panegyric Engels saying in its honor, and which fully corresponds to Marx's repeated statements, see the concluding passages of The Poverty of Philosophy and the Communist Manifesto with their proud and open proclamation of the inevitability of a violent revolution. See what Marx wrote nearly 30 years later in criticizing the Gotha program of 1875, when he mercilessly castigated the opportunistic character of the program. This panegyric is by no means a mere impulse, a mere declamation or political sally. The necessity of systematically imbuing the masses with this and precisely this view of violent revolution lies at the root of the entire theory of Marx and Engels. The betrayal of their theory by the now prevailing social chauvinist and Kautskyite trends expresses itself strikingly in both these trends, ignoring such propaganda and agitation. The supersession of the bourgeois state by the proletarian state is impossible without a violent revolution. The abolition of the proletarian state, that is, of the state in general, is impossible except through the process of withering away. Pause for a moment to appreciate that Klaus Schwab has a bust of Lenin on his bookcase, or at least he did in the past while he gave interviews. This is Lenin's view. A violent revolution must take place to get rid of capitalism and replace it by this new model, and then that model will enable withering away. This is the last remark of the chapter, a detailed and concrete elaboration of these views was given by Marx and Engels when they studied each particular revolutionary situation, when they analyzed the lessons of the experience of each particular revolution. We shall now pass to this, undoubtedly the most important part of their theory, which is the revolution. And so the book continues. Chapter 2 is titled The Experience of 1848 through 51, talking about the revolution of the time. And we'll pick up with that at a later date. So this is Lenin talking about the purpose of the state. The state exists in Marxist theory or Leninist theory to, well, both Marxism, Leninism, to secure, is to secure the class antagonism for the advantage of the upper class. Therefore, a violent revolution is necessary. After that, a new classless semi-state will take power through a dictatorship. Its purpose will be to abuse and destroy and suppress the previous ruling class, and to continue that process until that is done in the social transformation of people. Their transcendent Marxism arises in them, mostly through the forced inversion of praxis, or I should say partly through the forced inversion of praxis, mostly through the destruction of the old class. Anytime it's not working, it will be blamed on the existence and lingering or reemergence of the old class, which will then have to be rooted out and destroyed through the dictatorship of the proletariat. And this is the characteristic of 20th century Marxism, which obviously failed. One might say that Marxism-Leninism, with the little hyphen in between, which is what Mao said he practiced, is what the Soviet Union practiced, in that the theoretical idea was Marxism as laid out by Marx, but the practical idea was Leninism, which is that you have this enlightened vanguard who's going to organize a bunch of workers' councils called a Soviet that is going to be subservient to the party, that's going to enforce the dictatorship of the proletariat in order to carry out the revolution and then the new program in the name of the worker and in the name of the people or the masses or in the name of society. And obviously that didn't work. As I've made the point many times, though that's not the point of this particular podcast, the 21st century model, which follows from Deng Xiaoping and implements itself in the West through ESG, environmental social governance scoring, which is aligned with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of Agenda 2030. That program here globally, which we might call Dengism and Western Dengism, or the China model, the model of the China model, which I just recently did a whole podcast on. That's why I'm mentioning this here, previous episode. That model is using Marxism is the theory, or communism is the theory, or theoretical idea within it, and fascism is the practical idea, the practical application within it. And so hopefully that clarifies that we have a new vanguard, and the new vanguard is a managerial class that's going to administer the fascist economy that can produce, that was Lenin's theory of productive forces, but you still have the general idea of a dictatorship working in the name of the people, a dictatorship of the proletariat, so to speak, that is going to make sure that that fascist element develops, in, as Deng Xiaoping put it, according to the basic spirit of communism or of Marxism-Leninism, as it were. And so this is the situation that we find ourselves in today, but you can see that it's actually a mirror image with a 21st century reconstitution after the failures of Lenin's 20th century model manifested. But in any case, even in Lenin's Soviet Union and in Mao's People's Republic of China, it's still effectively, I mean, the state ran all the corporations. It didn't collude with corporations and allow the oligarchs to get rich. That's the only difference. It still ran a fascist economy operation under the auspices of the Communist Party being the chief corporation. The only difference between that and fascism is that in fascism, you actually have the state colluding with the corporate interests, but the people at the top of the corporate interests are allowed to run their businesses kind of like corporations and make hella money. And all of a sudden, right, so now all of the class interests align, right? Except for, of course, all those exploited workers in China who have to have nets installed on the side of their factory so they don't jump off the roof and die in their sweatshops. But never mind. And we don't have to talk about the class interests or the social interests of the Uyghur population, or never mind, under the rug. I don't want to digress. I want to close this up. So that's an introduction to Lenin's idea of the state, which he drew from Marx and Engels and is consonant with social theory. I don't think that his Bolshevik vanguard model has changed that much. He created workers' Soviet councils. We have a stakeholder managerial Soviet instead that's still councils who are going to determine what all the stakeholders, which is workers and consumers and everybody else, actually need. And we're operating in the same model. This is why so much that's going on with the woke movement or the Democratic Party and their rhino friends all draw a straight line back to Lenin, whether it's the DEI programs, which came from Lenin and Stalin in the early 20s, whether it's dekulakization, which is driving us out of our small businesses through, we're basically literally expropriating the kulaks, the American small business owners who can stand on their own 2 feet independently and don't have to be a part of a mega corporation that socializes their working conditions, tells them what to do, or working for the government. Same model, same reason, same activity, same elitist vanguard idea that the Democratic Party in this case knows better how to organize society, and that the despicable, deplorable Trump voters are voting against their own interests because they don't actually know what's good for them, and that's why they need a stakeholder Soviet to manage their lives. Please understand that history isn't repeating specifically, it's rhyming, and we're in the second verse of this same song, and we saw what happened when Lenin's song played out for 70 years in Soviet Union, and even from the first 5 years it was a catastrophe. Please take this seriously. The receipts are good, they're all there. I don't want to start pleading, so I'll just stop. Thanks for listening. We'll do another one soon.